So tonight we're going to be looking at our final controversial issue, namely war. Presentations can be slightly different than with our other issues. I'm not going to be presenting arguments for and against war. in the manner of previous classes. So rather, I'm going to explore historically the basis for the justification and conduct of war, known as the just war theory. And there's more than one theory. There have been a number of theories, but I'll just call it the just war theory. And then also we're going to look at justification, what is generally known as pacifism. I've provided you there with a summary of both just war criteria and pacifist principles. At the end, we may want to review that. I'll be mentioning all those during the talk. And if you have any questions during that time, please feel free to ask them. So we're going to start with just war theory, or sometimes known as a doctrine of military ethics. The purpose of the doctrine is to ensure that a war is morally justifiable through a series of criteria which must be met for it to be considered just. There have been a lot of these throughout history, and I'll be covering them as we go through. The purpose of the doctrine is to make sure that what you are doing is seen to be somehow legal, at least morally legal. And those criteria are then split into two groups. One is known as jus ad bellum, and the other is jus in bello. The first group concerns the morality of going to war. That's jus ad bellum. The second group concerns the moral conduct within war. Okay, so there are two categories. The moral justification of going to war, and then once you're in war, the moral conduct that needs to be followed. Some actually have been, recently have been called to say there should be a third category, jus post bellum, which would be dealing with morality of post-war reconstruction. Because once the war ends, once the fighting ends, that doesn't mean the conflict necessarily ends, as we have seen. Okay, the just war theory postulates the belief that while war is terrible, it is not always the worst option. I mean, the very fact that you have a justification for war, it must be just, but that's saying it is allowable. So all these theories allow for war. It's the pacifism which will reject war. So that when we're talking about just war theory, we've already assumed that there is a time, given the various theories, when war is considered just. For example, to meet important responsibilities and prevent atrocities may justify war, and have. Now, opponents to the just war theory usually come from one of two sides. Those who are inclined to a stricter pacifist position that say no war is justifiable. That's one. The other extreme, which opposes the just war theory, is a much more permissive sort of nationalist standard, which proposes that war only needs to serve a nation's interest. Might makes right. Okay. So, I mean, the reason I mention this, some people will be opposed to just war theory. So we don't need to justify war morally. If it's in the nation's interest, and there have been many wars fought on that basis. So, the historical aspect is called the just war tradition. And we're going to go over some of these. This tradition considers wars that have been fought in the past, when you look at them and try and analyze them as to whether they were moral or not. And then also the writings of philosophers and lawyers. These are legal questions often throughout history. So it's interesting. In 2017, there was a study done And it traces the just war tradition all the way back to ancient Egypt. The Egyptian ethics of war centered on three main ideas. One, the cosmological role of Egypt. In other words, Egypt was seen to be the center of the cosmos, which is important if you can see how that could lead to a justification. Second, the Pharaoh, as a divine office, was the executor of the will of the gods. And third, the superiority of the Egyptian state over all other states. Those were the bases. And from that, they developed a just war theory, which began by saying only a pharaoh could declare war. Why? Because he was representative of the gods. This is one of the early notions of God is on our side. And you find this in many reasons why people have gone to war. The way that worked out theoretically, from what we can make out of the documents, the Egyptians had a goddess by the name of Maat, M-A-A-T, who signified order and justice. If there was disorder, then the Pharaoh had the right to go to war. Okay? That was part of the just war theory from the ancient Egyptian point of view. We also find that in ancient Chinese philosophy, a lot of work on just war, much of it during the Zhou dynasty. That was from 1050 to 771 BCE. And this took place during a period in Chinese history called the Warring States. There were a lot of constant wars going on, and philosophers wanted to reflect on when are these wars okay and when are they not. Here it was said that war was justified only as a last resort. We're going to hear this a number of times in a number of different theories. Only as a last resort. And only when declared by a rightful sovereign. Okay, so that matched up with the Egyptian idea. Anyone can't just declare war. Okay, and we'll find this right throughout the various just war theories. It has to be a rightful sovereign. In the case of Egypt, that was the pharaoh. In the case of China, that was the emperor, or sometimes governors. But in any case, once war was declared by the sovereign, you could not go against his will. He was the ultimate authority on what was just and what was not. And how did you know whether it was just? If you won. If you won, it was considered just. Do you see how that would work? It's called the will of heaven. This also tied in with Chinese notions of rule, the mandate of heaven. If an emperor were overthrown, well, that was just, because he was overthrown. So there's a sort of pragmatic side here. In India, we have the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. It's the 8th century BCE. It includes extensive discussion of just wars, known as Dharma Yuddha. The text asks if the suffering caused by war can ever be justified. There's a long discussion. The Bhagavad Gita is part of that, where Arjuna goes to war. But just in brief, these criteria were needed to be considered. Proportionality. Chariots cannot attack cavalry. Only chariots. And no attacking people in distress. So the violence has to be proportional to be considered just. Not to use unjust means. No poisoned arrows or barbed arrows. and just cause. And we're going to hear this time and again. No attacking out of anger. No attacking out of anger. And for fair treatment of all captives and wounded. So this goes back in ancient Indian culture, ancient Chinese culture. People were fighting wars. And philosophers and thinkers had to ask questions. When are these justified and when not? And generally, if you're honest, it came down to the matter if the state wanted it. So when we move to the classical world, it was the Greek philosopher Aristotle, I've mentioned him a number of times, who first introduced the concept and terminology to the Hellenic world, where war was a last resort. We've seen this before, the last resort, and required conduct that would make impossible, this is important, that would not make impossible the restoration of peace. In other words, the consequences of war could not be worse than the causes of war. So if you have a cause to go into a war, you have to consider what the consequences will be. And if those consequences are worse than the condition you went to war for, then it's not just. That will come up later. He states he also is mainly for the purpose of self-defense. Aristotle felt war was just if it was in self-defense, but not for conquest. Of course, these can always be spun, as they often have been, but this is, remember, this is a philosopher speaking. So this is what he said. The proper object of practicing military training is not in order that men may enslave those who do not deserve slavery, in other words, to conquer, but in order that first they may themselves avoid being enslaved by others. Okay, so the purpose of a military is largely defensive. In ancient Rome, a just cause for war might include the necessity of repelling an invasion, or retaliation for pillaging, or the breach of a treaty. Those are the three main reasons Roman philosophers and lawyers, if we can use that term, felt that war. But they were always aware that war was always potentially wrong and risked divine in favor. You always had to be careful here because the gods were watching, so it had to be just. And that's why whenever the Romans went to war, that act had to be ritualized by a body of priests. There was a special, the Romans had a large, expansive priesthood that covered many different areas. One of them was just priests who had to deal with conflict and war. If you didn't get their blessing, then war would not be just. The quintessential explanation of just war theory in the Roman world is found in the Roman statesman Cicero, 1st century, where he states, "Then too, in the case of a state in its external relations, the rights of war must be strictly observed. For since there are two ways of settling a dispute, first by discussion, second by physical force. And since the former, this is the characteristic of man, and the latter of the brute, we must resort to force only in case we may not avail ourselves of discussion. The only excuse, therefore, for going to war is that we may live in peace unharmed. And when the victory is won, we should spare those who have not been bloodthirsty and barbarous in warfare." So Cicero was very careful about going to war. basically defensive. You should discuss first. Have you noticed this has been one of the common elements here? Last resort. You don't just jump into war emotionally. Although many of the Romans, there's a difference between theory and the way it was practiced. Okay. If you look at what Julius Caesar did, the conquest of Gaul, if you look at the various, they always found a way to justify. But we're looking really now at theoretical reasons. So let's move to the Christian theory of just war. It began around the 4th century with St. Augustine. This position, with some amendments, is still used by the Catholic Church today, and we'll add Aquinas in a moment, as a guide to whether or not a war can be justified. It holds that war may be necessary and right, even though it is never good. It may be necessary and right, but it can never be claimed to be good. That was St. Augustine. War is never good. It may be necessary and right. In the case of a country that has been invaded by an occupying force, war may be the only way to restore justice, according to St. Augustine. And he held that while individuals should not resort to violence, God has given the sword to government for good reason. So he's making a distinction. Because you turn the other cheek, that applies to you individually. But he says when it comes to the body politic, that may not be the way to go. And it's left up to the sword of government. Again, a sovereign, a legitimate sovereign. In his work called Against Manichaeism, he argues that Christians, as part of a government, need not be ashamed of protecting peace and punishing wickedness, then he adds, when forced to do so. Here he asserted peacefulness in the face of a grave wrong that could only be stopped by violence would be a sin. Thus he wrote, "They who have waged war in obedience to the divine command," it goes all the way back to the Egyptians, right? "Or in conformity with his laws, have represented in their persons the public justice, and have by no means violated the commandment, 'Thou shalt not kill.'" So he's making a distinction here between individual relationships and state relationships. However, he did not break down the specific conditions. We'll come to that. Aquinas does a little more of that. But he left it in the hands of the sovereigns, which shows the beginning of what will become the divine right of kings. The sword of the king is the divine sword. So according to Mark Maddox, who's actually the director of the Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction, he said Augustine intended his view to be a coping mechanism for righteous sovereigns, to ensure that their violent international encounters be minimal and a reflection of the divine will to the greatest extent possible. He also saw it as a coping mechanism for combatants who, by divine edict, obedience to government, have no choice but to follow their political masters. And these were two quotes that come from the Bible, from the New Testament, that was used to support this. Mark 12:17, which you probably all know, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give to God what belongs to God." And then Romans 13:1-7, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. This is Paul. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation. Now, you can see how that could be quite easily misused. But you see, the problem here is the one of individual ethics versus group and social ethics. How do we distinguish between those two? Augustine was very concerned that there had to be some sort of social consensus. So if the sovereign declared war and he was a righteous sovereign, you had to obey. I think he was fearful of anarchy. In any case. By the 13th century, we moved to Thomas Aquinas. And his views have had a very long impact on the just war theory in the West. His views on war drew heavily from a book, Decretum Gratiani, which was written by an Italian monk who took passages from the Bible. And then after its publication in the 12th century, it was republished. It was very popular. Aquinas read it. And it was also, a commentary was made by Pope Innocent IV. So in his major work, that's Aquinas' Summa Theological, he asserted that it is not always a sin to wage war. So he agrees with Augustine. And more significantly, he actually set out criteria. Augustine talks about it in general and says it's up to the sovereign, and hopefully the sovereign is righteous. Aquinas goes a little further. He says 3 requirements must be met. First, a war must be waged upon the command of a rightful sovereign. You see, this is running through all of these. And this tied in, by this time, the divine right of kings is well established. Second, the war needs to be waged for a just cause on account of some wrong that those who you're going to war against have committed. You can't just attack somebody. There has to be something they have done which is not just, and you are going to go to war with them. Thirdly, warriors must have the right intent, namely to promote good and to avoid evil. Why do you think that's added? Well, if you know anything about the history of war, when people go to war, there's some atrocious things that are done, all sides. One of the big ones, unfortunately, throughout the history of war has been rape. Why? Well, to some degree, early on, it was probably the idea that we're the virile power, we're conquering you, we're taking your women. And that was part. But it's always been rape and atrocity. The other thing, when men are put in war conditions and they see their fellows being mutilated, killed, it does something to the psyche. So I think Aquinas is here saying, okay, if you've got to go to war, still remember, individually, you can't act in certain ways. Is that an air raid siren?
No.
No.
My cell phone.
Oh.
Wow.
Okay. But nevertheless, Aquinas argued that violence must only be used, here we go again, as a last resort. And on the battlefield, violence was only justified to the extent it was necessary. See, some of these terms are rather loose, right? Soldiers needed to avoid cruelty. You couldn't kill the innocent. He did accept, however, you may have collateral damage. Do we all know what collateral damage is? Those are people who get killed without intentionally trying to kill them. Okay. And he said that if that happened and the intent was not there, then it wasn't a sin. So as a soldier, if you went in and were shooting up an area under command and you happened to kill some children, that was not a sin, because that was collateral damage. It's just how war works, unfortunately. So during the Renaissance, there was a university in Spain. It was the University of Salamanca. And they really delved into just war theory in a great deal of depth. They started with Augustine. These are Catholics, of course, so they started with Augustine. They used Aquinas, and then they developed it even further. Start by saying, war is one of the worst evils suffered by mankind. Okay. And the school's adherents reasoned that war should be the last resort, and only when necessary to prevent an even greater evil. Diplomatic resolution always preferable, even for the more powerful party. Examples of just war: self-defense. Now this is interesting. As long as there is reasonable possibility of success. To defend when you know you have no chance of success will just result in what?
More death.
More death. That's an interesting one considering what's going on right now. But that's, okay? But that was one of their notions. Second, preventive war against a tyrant who is about to attack. Do you know the term we use for that? It's called preemptive. That gets real dicey. You have to know that you are going to be attacked. And you can't just use that as a rationale if it isn't true. It's been used a lot of times. Third, war is okay to attack an unjust enemy. Now you're probably going to notice it's almost when you use a word to define itself, just war theory says it's based on justice.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, of course, the question is what is just?
Yeah.
And that's never easy. That's why it's generally held by all these theories that it has to be a sovereign in consultation with people who have really thought about this and used their tradition to come to terms with it. War is not legitimate or illegitimate simply based on its original motivation, so there has to be other requirements according to this university. It is necessary that the response be commensurate with the evil. To use more violence than is strictly necessary would be unjust. Here's an interesting one. If the people oppose a war, then it is not legitimate. This is probably to put a check on a rogue sovereign or rogue dictator. Okay. And this gives those people the right to react against, either in protest or otherwise. In fact, they went as far as to say, the people have a right to depose a government that is waging an unjust war or is about to wage an unjust war. 3, once war has begun, there remain moral limits. One may not attack innocents or kill hostages. Under this doctrine, expansionist wars, wars of pillage, wars to convert, wars for glory are all inherently unjust. So moving to contemporary time, the war doctrine of the just war doctrine of the Catholic Church in its 1992 Catechism, paragraph 2309, lists 4 strict conditions for legitimate military force. 1, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. So if you're being attacked, that has to be, it can't just be someone coming to your border and have a few shots. It has to be a lasting invasion, if you want. Grave, serious, and how's that going to be measured? Usually in loss of life. And certain. The certain part is so you can't just tell the people we're going to be attacked. Hitler used that a lot as a justification. 2, all other means of putting end to conflict must have been shown to be ineffective. So you have to have negotiated before you go to war. 3, this is an interesting one. There must be serious prospects of success. Because it was realized if there's not success, you're just wasting lives. 4, use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. That's again, the consequences. If you're going to go to war, you've got to know what the consequences are going to be. And if those are worse in terms of suffering and loss of life than the initial cause, even though you're right, that has to be taken into consideration. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church says the following. This is still the Catholic Church. States have the obligation to do everything possible to ensure that the conditions of peace exist, not only within their own territory, but throughout the world. It is important to remember, it is one thing to wage a war of self-defense, quite another to seek to impose domination on another nation. The possession of war potential does not justify the use of force for political or military objectives. Let's go, the possession of war potential. You can't say, we know that he's going to go to war, therefore we're going to attack. That's from the Catholic, this is the current Catholic position. Nor does the mere fact that the war has unfortunately broken out mean that all is fair by the warring parties. You still have limits. You still have conduct, which is required. We call it the Geneva Convention. So do you get the general feel for what's going on here? There's a general tendency to say war is not good. The world being what it is, it may be necessary at times. We have to be very, very careful when we use it. Only as a last resort, only when grave danger is there, generally in self-defense, trying to put roadblocks as much as possible. So what does the Methodist Church say about war? This comes from the social principles of the Methodist Church. We believe war is incompatible with the teachings and example of Christ. We therefore reject war as an instrument of national foreign policy. We oppose unilateral, first preemptive strike actions and strategies on the part of any government. As disciples of Christ, we are called to love our enemies, seek justice, and serve as reconcilers of conflict. We insist that the first moral duty of all nations is to work together to resolve by peaceful means every dispute that arises between or among them. We advocate the extension and strengthening of international treaties and institutions that provide a framework within the rule of law for responding to aggression, terrorism, and genocide. We believe that human values must outweigh military claims as governments determine their priorities. That the militarization of society must be challenged and stopped. That the manufacture, sale, and deployment of armaments must be reduced and controlled. And that the production, possession, or use of nuclear weapons be condemned. Consequently, we endorse general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. However, and you always notice the Methodists always have a however, or a but, or a yet, okay? Because they tend to be balanced. It's not a peace church in the manner of the Quakers. And I'll be talking about the Quakers in a moment. That is to say, it's not forthrightly pacifist. Because the Book of Discipline states, we also acknowledge that many Christians believe that when peaceful alternatives have failed, the force of arms may regretfully be preferable to unchecked aggression, tyranny, and genocide. We honor the witness of pacifists who will not allow us to become complacent about war and violence. We also respect those who support the use of force, but only in extreme situations and only when the need is clear beyond reasonable doubt and through appropriate international organizations. So again, generally opposed, theoretically, but there may be instances. So let me now just move. We have incorporated a little bit of this, but I want to add this. Not only is there the right to go to war, but the right conduct in war. Jus as bello, as found in the Geneva Convention. First, just war conduct should be governed by the principle of distinction. Okay, not anything goes. Acts of war should be directed only towards enemy combatants, not towards non-combatants, caught in circumstances they did not create. Prohibited acts include bombing civilian residential areas that contain no legitimate military targets, or attacking neutral targets, schools, hospitals, committing acts of terrorism or reprisal against civilians. Second, just war conduct should be governed by the principle of proportionality. We've seen this before. Combatants must make sure that the harm caused to civilians or civilian property is not excessive in relation to the direct military advantage of an attack. And when you come to think about it, to ask guys in war to have to come to these sorts of decisions when you're in a battlefield, not easy. I think I may have mentioned you, a very good friend of mine was a point man in Vietnam. And they were entering a village one day, and a young kid came running towards them with something in his hand. What do? You got men behind you. You don't know what's in that kid's hand. Now, did he sit back and say, now what does the Geneva Convention say? Probably not. He protected his men. He never got over it. Okay. Third, combatants may not use weapons or other methods of warfare that are considered evil, such as rape, forcing enemy combatants to fight against their own side, or using weapons whose effects cannot be controlled, i.e. biological weapons, chemical weapons. Fourth, combatants are not permitted to attack enemy combatants who have surrendered or who have been captured, who are injured, and are consequently not presenting an immediate lethal threat. Okay, we've mentioned this before. You may have met, the problem here is what is just. What might be just to one side will be unjust. And we have a classic example of World War I. In the early part of that war, a group of German Protestant theologians published a manifesto seeking to justify the actions of the German government. At the British government's request, the Archbishop of Canterbury led a collaborating group of religious leaders who wrote a rebuttal of the German position. Both sides claimed their position was just. In this card, you may remember the words of this song by, I always call him the poet Bobby, Bob Dylan. The First World War, boys, it came and it went. The reason for fighting I never did get. But I learned to accept it with pride. For you don't count the dead when God's on your side. That's his song, When God's on you. He goes through all the wars. The question was raised once again with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Pope John Paul II stated that the war did not satisfy the just war requirements set by St. Augustine and other theologians. As he stated, no to war. What are we to say of the threat of war which could strike the people of Iraq, the land of the prophets, the people already sorely tried by more than 12 years of embargo? War is never just another means that one can choose to employ for settling differences between nations. Washington has not offered conclusive evidence of imminent danger to its national security. A statement made by the Council of Bishops of the United Methodist Church lamented the continued warfare by the United States and coalition forces and prayed for military personnel and their families who have sacrificed as a result of this war, and for a swift end to the destruction and violence raging in Iraq. While other denominations also opted for peaceful negotiations, the Southern Baptist Convention took a different stance, claiming the case for using force to bring about disarmament and regime change in Iraq was clearly and convincingly made for anyone who has eyes to see and ears to hear. Our choice is to pay less now and deal with the problem, or we can pay a lot more later and deal with a nuclear-armed Saddam. So there were, again, differences. What is just? What is unjust? President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod said, "Our president has been entrusted with a sword. He has the right to use it." Going back to... Okay, before turning to pacifism, let me just say a couple things about Islam. Interestingly enough, Islamic civilization has also developed its just war theories. And in many ways, if you read them, they closely mirror those that came out of medieval Europe. So I'm not going to go over all the details. But briefly, Muslim jurists divided the world into two spheres. Dar al-Islam, the realm of peace, and Dar al-Harb, the realm of war. Dar al-Islam were those lands under Muslim control or foreign lands where Muslims were not persecuted. That was Dar al-Islam, the land of peace. Dar al-Harb was those lands where Muslims were openly discriminated against or persecuted. Jihad, just military conduct, was allowed only in Dar al-Harb. So that was always seen as a kind of defensive. Now, was this always practiced? No. Again, we're getting back to theory now. Theoretically, war could not be justified in an area where there was peace. And this was important, it could only be acted upon when supported by fatwa, which was a ruling of a qualified Muslim jurist, a leading jurist. It'd be similar to the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court had to make decisions on war. How we do it? Just before I get to pacifism, this is interesting in terms of what took place. What was the name? What's
9/11.
no? But yeah, but who's the guy that we went out and got and killed?
Saddam?
No, you know. Oh, how,
That's all right.
anyway, when he declared war on the United States, okay, he issued a fatwa, but he wasn't a jurist. He had no right to issue a fatwa. It would be like some evangelical or some person in the United States got up and issued a fatwa. I mean, so his fatwa against the United States was in Muslim law. Anyone can't just issue a fatwa. His name will come to me by the end of this class, I assure you. Okay, so let's move to pacifism. It's the position that is opposed to war and militarism, including conscription and mandatory military service. The word was coined by the French peace campaigner Émile Arnaud at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was adopted by the peace activists at the 10th Universal Peace Conference in 1901. A related term, and this comes from the East, mainly from India, is ahimsa. In Sanskrit, himsa means violence. Is a negative prefix. Ahimsa, non-violence, do no harm. It's the core philosophy in religions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. In the mid-17th century, under the influence of its founder, the Quakers. Does anyone know who the founder was? George Fox. George Fox. Were prominent advocates of pacifism. Fox refused to defend himself when he was attacked, and often when the violence was over, he had kind words for his attackers. He was trying to live literally the imitation of Christ. Quakers stated their beliefs in a declaration sent to King Charles II. We utterly deny all outward wars and strife, and fighting with outward weapons, for any end, or under any pretense whatever. This is our testimony to the whole world. The Spirit of Christ which leads us into all truth, will never move us to fight a war against any man with outward weapons, neither for the kingdom of Christ nor for the kingdoms of the world. The English Quaker William Penn, who founded the province of Pennsylvania, employed an anti-militarist public policy for 75 years. From 1681 to 1756, the province was essentially unarmed and experienced little or no warfare. Penn claimed, "A good end cannot sanctify evil means, nor must we ever do evil that good may come of it." That's the ultimate pacifist position. Now you have to remember, the pacifists, the reason perhaps they can say this is they believe very much in life after death. What goes on here is minuscule. What you do here will count big time there. At the Society's yearly meeting in London in 1916, it was stated, "War, in our view, involves the surrender of the Christian ideal and the denial of Christian brotherhood. Christ demands of us that we adhere without swerving to the methods of love. Therefore, if a conflict should arise between the claims of his service and those of the state, it is to Christ that our supreme love must be dedicated." Now, this is the Quakers. Now, this is the extreme position on the other side. Pacifism was adopted quite late in his life, actually, by the Russian novelist Count Leo Tolstoy. One of his late works was entitled "The Kingdom of God is Within You." Here he supported the principle of nonviolent resistance when confronted by violence, as this is what was taught by Jesus, according to Tolstoy. When Jesus says to turn the other cheek, Tolstoy asserts that he meant to abolish violence, even the defensive kind, and to give up revenge. He rejected the interpretation of medieval scholars who attempted to limit its scope. Thus he asks, how can you kill people when it is written in God's commandments, thou shalt not kill? Now remember, Augustine had made a distinction between the individual and the communal. Okay. Tolstoy thinks that that's an attempt to spin. He then added, this is a choice that cannot be avoided. People often think the question of non-resistance to evil by force is a theoretical one, which can be neglected. Yet this question is presented by life itself to all men and calls for some answer from every thinking man, let's say person. Ever since Christianity has been outwardly professed, this question is for men in their social life like the question which presents itself to a traveler when the road on which he has been journeying divides into two branches. He must go on, and he cannot say, I will not think about it, but will go on just as before. There was one road, now there are two, and he must make a choice. You know who greatly was influenced by Tolstoy? Gandhi. Gandhi read Tolstoy. They communicated, actually. We have letters that they wrote. This was when he was in South Africa. And he called his nonviolent opposition to violence satyagraha, holding fast to truth. Gandhi would never call himself passive. He didn't like the term passive resistance. He said, when you walk into someone swinging a club at you and you know you're going to get hit, that's not passive. He called it active resistance. It was just nonviolent. The essence of satyagraha is to eliminate antagonism without harming the antagonist. A satyagrahi, therefore, does not seek to end or destroy the relationship with the antagonist, but to transform or purify the individual. A euphemism sometimes used for satyagraha is soul force. The theory of satyagraha, and this sees means and ends as inseparable. He had a theoretical basis for this. The means to obtain an end, he said, are wrapped up in and attached to that end. You can't separate them. If you use violent means, you will, by the law of karma, get violent ends. You don't have a choice in that. That's just how it works, according to Gandhi. Therefore, it is contradictory to try to use unjust means or violent means to obtain justice, or to use violent means to obtain peace, if his theory is right. If what you're doing is going to have violent results, thus Gandhi rejected out of hand that injustice should be fought against by any necessary means. If one uses violent, coercive, or unjust means, whatever end one produces will be unjust. I mean, I guess the way you could look at that is look at any war and see what happens afterwards. Of course, Gandhi's satyagraha influenced Martin Luther King, as seen in the following two quotes. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Okay, there are a few major arguments against pacifism. One, it's unrealistic, overly idealistic. It doesn't work in this world. It's too optimistic a view of humanity. It can't be a national policy, as it will only work if the other side agrees. And finally, it has no place in the face of extreme evil. There are times when people have a moral obligation to fight in war. Okay, I'll just finish by going back to Bob Dylan. Through many dark hours, I've been thinking about this, that Jesus Christ was betrayed by a kiss. But I can't think for you. You'll have to decide whether Judas Iscariot had God on his side. So now as I'm leaving, I'm weary as hell. The confusion I'm feeling, ain't no tongue can tell. The words fill my head and they fall to the floor. That if God's on our side, he'll stop the next war. Okay, if you want, we can just briefly go over the summary of each one, if you have, and I'll take any questions or comments. So, summary of the just war criteria. I've tried to get the main ones here. War should only be waged for a just cause on account of grievous wrong by the attacked. We've seen the problem here is defining justice. 2, war must only be waged as a last resort. 3, war must only be waged upon the command of a rightful sovereign. Osama bin Laden. There it was. I knew it would come. Just let it go. Yeah, you remember Osama bin Laden issued the fatwa. Yeah, sorry. 4, war must be primarily defensive. Only under dire circumstances can it be preemptive. Remember what preemptive means? You attack first. Okay. But dire circumstances. 5, war should be waged only if there is a reasonable possibility of success. This is one which is often not thought a lot about. Okay? It doesn't make any sense to go to war, according to the just war theory, if you're going to lose. Because all you're going to do is kill a lot of people. Now, it may be seen as a brave thing to do, and that's another issue, heroic. Yeah. War should be waged only with the support of the people, that's especially in democratic societies. Wars must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. And there were claims, of course, that that's what happened in Iraq. Saddam Hussein, you got rid of him, but then you had the Sunni-Shia conflict that followed. So you got to know what's down the line. You have to see the larger. Acts of war should be directed towards enemy combatants, not towards non-combatants. Do you know when that changed?
When they started putting troops in the schools.
World War II.
Yeah.
World War I was fought out in the fields, charging. And it started with bombing of civilian cities.
Yeah.
Hitler always said he bombed London because one of the British planes mistakenly dropped bombs on Berlin and killed residents. And that's when that type of bombing, and then the idea of total war. Total war means it's not just armies against each other, it's populations. Anybody is game in the theory of total war. That doesn't come under the just war theory, by the way. But it's the one that's used. Combatants may not use weapons or other methods of warfare whose effects cannot be controlled. Chemical, biological weapons. Combatants are not permitted to attack enemy combatants who have surrendered, or those who have surrendered must be treated humanely. And then the summary of the pacifist principles. The waging of war by a state and the participation in war by any individual are absolutely wrong under any circumstance. Thou shalt not kill means thou shalt not kill. Pragmatic pacifism holds that the costs of war and interpersonal violence are so substantial that better ways of resolving disputes must be found. A good end cannot sanctify evil means. Evil must not be done that good may come of it. If one uses violent, coercive, or unjust means, whatever ends one produces will necessarily be embedded in that injustice. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence. Only love can conquer hate. So now you have to go home and figure out where you stand. I mean, the one thing that Tolstoy called you out, you can't just say, I don't know where I stand on this. I'll just let someone else decide. Where do you stand? And and I would think most people that I know think at some point war is just. Yeah. What's going on in the Ukraine today? Yeah. But then there's always the other position. When will we learn that wars don't get us anything really?